Okay, that seems to be on, so hopefully I'll be able to edit some of this. Hi, this is Tony Kent, and this is another episode of Tony Kent Writes and Cross-Examines, which is the very worst name that I could have for something like this, given who I am talking to today, which is a barrister who is probably an awful lot more experienced than me when it comes to cross-examination, and undoubtedly better at it. And that is IMRAN Mahmood, who is a barrister of over 20 years standing and an author so far of one book, which was the incredibly critically acclaimed You Don't Know Me, a unique book set in a courtroom that we'll be talking about in due course, but also the author of a book that's about to come out. I believe he's on about the third round of edits that he'll be able to tell us a little bit about in the course of the next 15 minutes. Imran, nice to speak to you.
Nice to speak to you in this terrible time.
Exactly.
Interesting times.
Interesting times, but ordinarily you and I might see each other, well, very rarely, but might see each other wandering around various courtrooms, but not at the moment because, as people might not realise, we have to do our hearings like this now.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. So if you're having a Zoom chat and there's a judge in one corner and the defendant in another corner and you're in one corner, it's very, very surreal, isn't it?
It's extremely strange. I was in a plea and trial preparation hearing for a murder case about a month ago, and I'm being led in that case by a QC, and there are 3 co-defendants, all with QCs and juniors, and so I was on the Zoom call, but there was absolutely no need whatsoever for me to be there, because as you know, if you're a junior, you don't speak at those kind of things. Your leader speaks. And so the little box that tells you whether or not you're even there just went off for me. So it really does make, I mean, when normally if you're a junior, you can at least feel important because you're robed and you're in court and you're sitting in the right place. It really does put you in your place when you're a junior on a Zoom chat.
I was in a case where the prosecution, Silk, was leading a junior who had taken Silk in the kind of intervening period. Yeah. And so they were both sitting in the front row, and it was a High Court judge said to the prosecution, the kind of leader, said, "What's your junior doing sitting in the Silk's row?" And he said, "Oh, well, she's become Silk now." And he said, "I don't care what she's become. She's your junior. She sits behind you." Actually, it's very, very rude.
I'm now tempted to try and name that judge.
Well, I don't think I could. One of the reasons I can't do it is that he's sadly passed away.
Okay, that'd be a very, very specific kind of game for an interview like this, wouldn't it? Name that judge. Well, literally the only 2 authors in crime writing that could engage in that very dull game.
I bet it'd be some good stories would follow, wouldn't they?
Well, we can't tell any of them, unfortunately. Right, no record. No. So you've got your second book coming out. Is it in 2020 or is it back to 2021?
Yeah.
We don't know these days.
21 January. We think January so far. Well, it's a bit of a movable feast at the moment, but that's I think what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
2020.
Now your first book, You Don't Know Me. Now I've said this to you face to face many times. Is one of the most unique books I've ever read, and also, despite the fact that its central premise is you're the one that actually says this, central premise is absurd of a 5-day speech. At the same time, it is the closest thing I've ever read to what really goes on in a courtroom. So how do you follow
that? First of all, it's very kind of you to say that. And it's a real compliment when it comes from somebody who's in the profession, certainly. So thank you.
You're welcome, and it's completely true.
So following it was a bit tricky because in that book, it's just the defendant giving his closing speech, as I imagined a defendant might if he had to do the case himself. And then so I can either follow that by doing a different speech for a different crime, and then just go through every crime in the statute books. But I didn't think I could get away with that.
Yeah, you'd have less reviews using the word unique if you did that.
It's then become a series. We're doing the series. Fraud victim. 3 in the series. Burglar. So I decided to write a psychological thriller, which was, in fact, loosely based on somebody I met so in the story that I wrote, it follows the homeless man who's escaping from the rain. He's very bright. He's Oxbridge educated, but his life has kind of taken a turn, and so he hides out in some Mayfair house. And while he's there, he witnesses a murder from kind of behind the sofa as he's watching it. And then by the time he's reported it to the police, everything about this place, everything about this house has changed dramatically, so that it can't even be seen as the same place. But there's the central character, the homeless person, who's based on somebody I met once in Liverpool when I was a teenager. So I used to go to this library local to where we lived, and there was this guy. He was just there once every couple of weeks, and he had a massive beard. And he lived on the streets, and he was always there just reading kind of science magazines and novels. And I thought, this is really strange. Because my 16-year-old self associated homelessness with just kind of straightforward unemployment, which was rooted in the lack of educational opportunities. And I thought, I wonder what's happening there. And then one day he came to me and said, "Oh, are you studying French?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you want to buy my collection of Proust?" And I was like, "Why have you got Proust? Why have you got Proust?"
Where do you keep a collection?
And he used to keep his books with a friend of his in his house, and he'd go there occasionally for bath and to clean up, and then he was back on the streets again. And I remember talking to him once, and I said, in fact, the next thing that happened was that I bumped into a French teacher at my school, right? And he said, "Oh, I saw that you met, what's his name?" And I said, "Oh, you mean the homeless guy?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Who was he?" I said, "Oh, he was our brightest student in that year. And he went to Oxford and he got a double first in something or other, and he worked for a blue chip company. And, and then suddenly his life took a turn and he went completely off the kind of traditional rails. And decided that that life wasn't for him." And when I asked him about it, when I said, "Oh, yeah, you can," again speaking as a 16-year-old, I was saying, "Oh, well, you can do anything you want. You've got a degree from Oxford." And he was like, "Well, I've done my bit for society. I'm not going to engage in this." And he had a kind of philosophical construct for his new life, which I was just fascinated by. It stayed with me.
And he's sort of turned out to be the inspiration for your new main character.
Yeah. So that the character of the kind of hyper-educated homeless man was based on totally.
And when you obviously said that the idea of the book is he goes back, so he'll finally report what he's seen to the police, and goes back to the address, and the address bears no relation at all. It looks like a completely different place, no body, no murder, different layout, etc. And is the sort of premise of the book whether or not we believe that he saw what he saw, whether or not he's an unreliable narrator, unreliable reporter? I mean, is there any doubt in our mind that he's, as a reader, of what he saw?
I think the idea was to leave some room for manoeuvre there. Because, I mean, ultimately it's a book about memory.
Yeah, okay.
So
going back to Proust.
Exactly, going back to Proust, and that whole scene of it's there, and that this idea about how we construct memory, and whether our memories represent real experience, or whether we are talking about a reconstructed, imagined experience. And
that's fascinating.
If you improperly remember something, does that change the facts of what's happened in the past?
Yeah.
Does that make your past unreliable? What does that do for your kind of...
Can I read this quite soon? This sounds fascinating. I love everything you've just said. I mean, that really has just, my ears are pricking up underneath my earphones.
Well, I would love it if you would read a copy. I would love if you read the copy when it was out.
I'm going to hold you to that. There is a barrister, actually. There is a barrister, and I don't know whether I need to remember her name, and I will find her name and send it to you, whose father is one of the leading authorities on memory. And I had an appeal against conviction with her in Snaresbrook literally 3 or 4 months ago. February, in fact, in February. And she was telling me at the time that there is actually no such thing as memory. There is literally no such thing, and it is all your brain. It's whatever your brain constructs. There isn't a transference of that. You imagine it goes through your eye and then gets stored somewhere. She said that doesn't happen. Your brain creates the memory when you want to access it, and that's why you have these differences in memory. That's why, as you know, if you get 5 people in a bar all watching the same fight, they'll all describe a different fight. It's not because they're all looking at different angles. It's because there isn't actually a memory. I mean, it's a fascinating conversation. I should put you in touch with that.
Yeah, no, I have to say that's totally my experience of it as well, not just kind of professionally, but also when I think back about the earliest memories I have, and they're all constructs, and they usually start with an old Polaroid that I've seen myself, and then I've kind of worked back from there to say, oh, well, this is what I looked like, this is what I was holding, this must have been what was happening on that day. It's sunny on that day. You know, do I remember a long hot summer of '77? Yeah, probably not. But what's probably happened is that everything that's gone on around me has fed into to create a memory that probably doesn't. It probably isn't real. All we've got really is a sense of what we think our memories are.
Well, I've seen the one thing I don't have them anymore because they're in video form. But I remember watching videos of boxing matches. And you'd think you would remember a boxing match quite well because it's literally you and one other guy, and it's not very long. And I'll watch these videos, and fair enough, someone's punching you in the head, so that might explain why it's not perfect. But I watch these videos, and I remember the fights completely differently. Completely differently. It's like, I mean, I don't even get necessarily the length of the fights right. I think it goes around and it goes 3, and it's very strange.
Well, that must. I'd have thought have something to do with the levels of adrenaline kind of in your system.
Yeah, I guess there's probably a factor. Yeah.
But I don't know whether you found the same with. I find the same with cases. If I am appealing something and I get transcript of examination, I read it, and it's either I'm reading something back thinking, "Wow, this is pretty good," or I'm reading it back going, "Oh my God, this is much."
I'm always the latter of the two, I have to say. Normally, if I read it and say that's really good, I don't realise it was the other guy talking.
But I don't know whether you find that, but when you look back at your cross-examination, you're sometimes surprised at the things that you've asked.
Yes, no, I'm surprised in the direction that it's taken, because obviously you go in there with your idea, you've got your plan, you know what your case plan is, you know where you're going to go with it, and then you bring it back and you've gone everywhere but there. Yeah.
It's but when you try and remember, it's a totally different thing.
But weirdly enough, the one thing I can do, whatever way the memory that apparently doesn't exist according to this person, still I can remember everything that's said by a witness, no matter how long the case is. But I can never remember the witnesses' names.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Very, very strange. I can stand. I've had arguments with 2 or 3 judges where they've got their notes, and I'll be saying, "Well, that's just wrong." Well, where's your note? I haven't got one. I was answering the questions, and I don't take notes when I'm answering questions. Then I'll go with my note. I said, "No, I think we need to listen to the tape." And I've always been right 100% of the time because I can remember for whatever. It's a quirk. My brain works that way. But I literally cannot remember the names. When I stand up for a speech, I have to have every name in the case written down on a page. Quite often, it's the only page of any writing on it.
I was once involved in a 4-month case with another barrister, and his client was called Rogers. Bear in mind, this went on for 4 months, and this was in Blackfriars, where whenever your case was on their tannoy, or with all parties in the case of Rogers and others, go to court, whatever. 4 months of this. And the guy who was representing him in his closing speech called him Roberts throughout the speech. And in fact, throughout the case. I think
and never turned up to court because he didn't understand the tannoy. Listen, Imran, believe it or not, 14 minutes, 30 seconds have already passed. It flies. So I'm going to have to say goodbye. Before I go, I want to ask, number one, what's the new book called? Do you have a name yet?
It is currently called, I think it's going out under the name of I Know What I Saw. I Know What I Saw. So everyone needs to look for I Know What I Saw in January 2021.
And they need to buy You Don't Know Me. And now I need to say goodbye before we hit 15 and it all goes wrong. So thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you, Tony.